Hello again for another week of Babbling with the Browns, a podcast where we scour up details on the past. I am Annie Brown, and I am sat beside my usual partner, Abby Brown. Abby, say hello to the people who pay our bills.
Hiya! Today we are going to delve into a decade full of American change, the 1970s. At the very beginning of this time period, there was a change in leadership that led to many of the other events that took place.
Who was it again? Nixon?
Yes, you are correct. It was Richard Nixon who was elected as president. Richard Nixon started his presidency in January of 1969, so the U.S. was experiencing extreme changes under the leadership of somebody new. Nixon's new domestic policy, new federalism, led the U.S. away from Johnson's Great Society. He wanted to give some of the federal responsibilities regarding social welfare to local governments. Another event that took place was Watergate, which occurred in 1972. This was when men hired by Nixon broke into the Democratic headquarters at the Watergate Hotel with the hopes of finding out the political plan of leading Democrats. Nixon had recorded the events and discussions that had taken place in the White House. The White House had created an enemy list, which included the names of Americans who opposed Nixon. Watergate had paralyzing effects on politics of the 1970s. People no longer trusted the government, and this led to the switch in who voted, Democrat and Republican. This also led to Nixon resigning in 1974.
Sounds to me like the United States had some sorting out to do. I guess there were a lot of internal issues.
You got that right. I am not sure I'm the biggest supporter of Nixon and his choices throughout his presidency.
Look on the bright side, at least it's behind us in history.
Annie, what an ignorant comment to make. Haven't you ever heard that history repeats itself?
During the 70s, the U.S. had troops over in Vietnam, a bloody disaster if you ask me. But no matter how chaotic it was, it led to tension throughout the entire country that would define this time period. The 20-year war in Vietnam that had started in 1955 and split American society finally ended in 1975. Unfortunately, when Nixon took office, more than 500,000 U.S. troops were still in Vietnam. Many people were upset with the war, which led to anti-war protests. For example, in 1970, Nixon expanded the war by forcing the U.S. troops to invade Cambodia with the hopes of destroying the Vietnamese bases there. Protests at colleges like Kent State broke out, where students were killed by the National Guard. Another incident was in 1970 when the public heard about an incident in My Lai, Vietnam, where there had been a mass killing of women and children by U.S. troops. The people were furious. Finally, in 1971, the leaking of the Pentagon Papers, which were when the public found out about a secret government history that had documented all the mistakes and deceptions of U.S. leaders involving the Vietnam War since its start, led to protest. In 1973, the draft ended and the last U.S. troops were removed from Vietnam. It wasn't until 1975 that the Vietnam War was declared finished by new President Gerald Ford.
War sucks. It's all resolved now, though, isn't it?
Honestly, Abby, how stupid can one person be? I didn't realize you were this unintelligent.
Gosh, that was harsh.
Abby, just stop. We can resolve this later. You seem to have forgotten that we are on air.
Personally, what I'm about to talk about is my favorite part of the 1970s.
Let me guess, music?
I can't imagine what is up next for us to talk about. I feel like this has been going on for the whole 70s decade.
Stop complaining, Abby. We are about to talk about another really interesting topic. Next up is television. Although it already existed, they began televising things that the population had never been exposed to. For the first time, fighting was shown to the public. It showed the harsh realities of war, blood, and sadness. Also, a rise in popularity of the family sitcom gave Americans of all ages, but especially children, ideas about what an American family should look like and how they should behave. One popular example is the Brady Bunch. In 1971, CBS canceled several shows such as The Beverly Hillbillies, Hee Haw, and Green Acres because most of their shows had been about life out west and were considered rural-oriented. This led to a rise in socially conscious programming, which talked about life all across America. Another televised event was the first two men, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, walking on the moon. This was astonishing for Americans to see, and it led to other accomplishments in the space race against the USSR.
TV is incredible, but terrible at the same time. I don't get around to watching much of it.
I love TV. It's just such a revolutionary invention. I am practically a certified doctor from the amount of Grey's Anatomy I watch.
What I'm about to tell you guys is once again a battle, but unlike Vietnam, it didn't involve troops or any of that other military stuff. Up next on today's episode is the Battle of the Sexes, a very controversial topic if you ask me. Feminism went mainstream in the 1970s as women wanted to be liberated in all aspects of life. The women's movement attracted women of all backgrounds, races, and political beliefs because many women felt like second-class citizens. Major leaders in the women's movement included Gloria Steinem, Susan Brown Miller, and Kate Millett. These women emerged as the faces and voices of their generation. A Times article titled "Who's Come a Long Way, Baby" was published in 1970. It explored ideas such as equal pay for equal work, abortion reforms, chances at jobs traditionally reserved for men, and state-supported child care centers. Women made up more of the U.S. population than men, yet had fewer rights. This deemed them recognition as the 51% minority. In 1975, Time awarded Man of the Year to all American women. There were some women in opposition to the women's movement, most notably Phyllis Schlafly. Their views that the EPA would strip away certain protections that women were granted, such as child support and exemption from the military draft. These women were called pro-family supporters. In November of 1977, women used the National Women's Conference as a chance to revive the dwindling fight for equal rights and formulate a plan of action to deliver to President Carter.
Beyoncé says herself, "Girls run this world."
Touché.
Now this next topic is the interesting stuff. Sit back and relax because we're about to talk about crimes.
You say that like it's a good thing.
Whatever, Abby. Back to what I was saying. At this time, there was a massive spike in national crime rates. The idea of the serial killer was enhanced with a huge increase in number within society. In the 1960s, there were about 19 documented killers who could be classified as serial killers. However, this number rose to 119 in the 1970s. Some claimed that every city and township seemed to have its own resident serial killer. Some notable serial killers were Ted Bundy, son of Sam, John Wayne Gacy, and Henry Lee Lucas. The heavy presence of media helped to increase the public's widespread fear of violence. The film industry heightened the hysteria through creating films centered around serial killers such as Maniac, The Toolbox Murders, Frenzy, The Last House on the Left, Deranged, and The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. In cities such as New York City, street violence was at an all-time high. Police reported there to be an average of 250 felonies per week.
I feel like I read a book once about the time when New York City's underground transportation transformed into an urban area run by crime and violence.
Oh, did you now?
Yep, was a pretty interesting book. I definitely recommend it.
Well, what's it called? If you're going to recommend the book to me and all of our listeners, a title may be useful.
That's a good question. I forgot. Finally, we get to tell you guys all about the environment. I know, you're thrilled, but anyways, like Teddy Roosevelt did, the leaders of this time created several programs to help protect our planet. The first Earth Day was implemented by President Richard Nixon in 1970, and there was participation by 20 million citizens. The nation had growing concerns over air and water pollution and the destruction of the natural environment, including wildlife. In 1970, Congress passed the Clean Air Act and the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency, also known as the EPA. This was followed by the passing of the Clean Water Act in 1972 and the Endangered Species Act of 1973. In 1980, the Superfund was created to clean up toxic dumps, such as Love Canal in Niagara Falls, New York. These laws regulated toxic substances, public drinking water systems, dumping of waste, and protected natural environments and wildlife, such as the American bald eagle.
Earth Day, that is my favorite holiday. Actually, I take that back. Groundhog's Day is my favorite holiday.
Groundhog's Day? Seriously? I personally prefer St. Patrick's Day. Luck of the Irish, you know what I mean?
Just stop talking, Abby. You've already embarrassed yourself enough.
We are getting so off topic. Let's just finish this already. I'm getting sick of you.
Well, that concludes this week's episode of Babbling with the Browns. Listen in again next week because our new topic is the 1980s, and it should be an exciting one. We are going to have fun, just like Madonna.
Tune in next time for Jazzercise!